Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. Such a pleasure to be able to speak to you today.
Hi,
Uh,
Sarah.
Hi there. Maybe you could kick off with a brief introduction to this incredible film. What can audiences expect if they watch Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris?
Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is a fairy tale for grown-ups. It's a piece of escapism and it is magic realism. So if you are struggling with life today, world problems, too much news, funerals, whatever it is that's depressing you, go to the cinema and you'll have a really lovely time for at least a couple of hours.
Where was the seed first sown for you to make this film? How did you come across Paul's book, and what made you think this was just going to work so well on the big screen?
I'm a lifelong Paul Gallico fan. I started reading his books as a child. And so when I decided to sign with a manager in LA, I picked the manager who also manages the Paul Gallico estate. And he was the one who first put this book under my nose. Having grown up partly in Paris as well as in the UK, it was a world that I felt I could recreate authentically. And then I was immediately drawn to this utterly charming central character, this underdog that you can't help rooting for. So there were so many elements that I thought would suit me and my background and my filmmaking. But also, although there has been a television version of this story, there's never been a big screen version. And I felt the story lent itself to the kind of scale that would justify a big screen release. It has some fantastic set pieces, a scene at the dog races, an incredible fashion show, a cabaret, a film premiere, and it's also absolutely rich with visual detail, which I don't think you can capture when you see it on the small screen.
Mm.
It's also a film that I think benefits from being part of a communal experience where other people are laughing and crying around you. And apparently there's been a lot of spontaneous applause at the end of the film. And I don't think you get that when you're sitting in your sitting room at home.
And you've managed to put together such a wonderful cast, from Jason Isaacs to Isabelle Huppert, obviously an absolute icon. Lucas, who people might have sort of been seeing more recently on their screens from another Paris set series, Emily in Paris. But right at the centre, Lesley Manville, who, I mean, she's been on our screens for such a long time, but have we so often seen her in this really big leading role? And she absolutely kind of knocks it out the park. So how did you put all this cast together? But in particular, how did you work with Lesley?
It all did start with Lesley in the sense that it's called Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. So if you haven't found your Mrs. Harris, you're in trouble. You can't really go anywhere else. And it was a very difficult role to cast because she's really a character. It requires a character actress who nevertheless is a leading lady and can garner the kind of finance that is required to mount, a fairly ambitious film like this. And I was lucky enough that Lesley had been nominated for an Oscar for Phantom Thread, which in a way put her on a different level and made it possible for me to start my campaign to cast her as Mrs. Harris, because I always knew that she had the depth and the complexity and the charm and the authenticity, because she also comes from a working class background, to really put this character across in a very multi-layered and fascinating way.
And in terms of her kind of being there as kind of executive producer as well, so was that quite kind of a collaborative relationship that maybe went beyond the normal kind of director actress relationship? Were you kind of working together on other aspects of the film as well?
Once she was cast, I always went back to her with suggestions and questions about the remaining cast. I had some ideas, but with her extraordinary experience, she's made many more films than I have. She's done huge amounts of theater. And so I really sort of double checked all my instincts about who to cast in the supporting roles. So that was one way in which she was very much involved in that early process. But I think she trusted me with the rest. And I think she's very happy with the cast that we ended up with.
Mm. And can you talk us through some of the highlights you have working with the other people involved with the film?
Any director will tell you that working with Isabelle Huppert is a seemingly unattainable dream. She's one of the busiest actresses on the planet, so even just finding a time slot for her is almost impossible, let alone it's a bit like trying to get Meryl Streep, really. Everybody sends her everything. But as with all things in the film industry, I had a backdoor connection. My executive producer, Philippe Carcassonne, had worked with her a few times and slipped her the script. And she said, this is charming and appealing. She's become increasingly fascinated with fashion, and she's the face of Balenciaga, and she's really quite out there in terms of her fashion sense. She's an absolute style icon. And she knew that I would make her look $1 million. So that was also part of the appeal of playing this part. But ultimately, it was going to come down to who was playing Mrs. Harris, and she had huge respect for Lesley. And Paul Thomas Anderson is an auteur director who's very much admired in France. So having done Phantom Thread, I think Isabelle was reassured that she would be working with somebody of equal stature to herself. And yes, I mean, we worked very harmoniously together. I absolutely adored working with Isabelle. It wasn't intimidating at all. She's a worker, and she's a perfectionist. And, you know, we eventually found our way through this rather kooky and delightful character. She's not just intimidation. She's also quite funny and quite humble in a way.
And I'm almost out of time, but if you could say a few words as well about how you went about, I guess when you don't have an absolutely enormous budget, kind of doing a period set film is always going to be a challenge. So how you kind of manage that, and, you know, just the incredible costumes. I think you're working with Jenny Bevan on those. But then maybe just to say a few words as well about, you know, what you think people can take away, because there is that kind of escapist kind of sentiment to it. But also this, you know, a few messages you might see of, like, you know, it is never too late to go and follow your dream. And also the kind of simplicity of her dream, you know, it is really about this one dress, not necessarily about her climbing social stratas and so on and so forth. So
all true. Well, the secret to being able to make a period film on a very tight budget, in this case, ended up being filming the majority of it in Budapest, where they have phenomenal crews, but the daily cost of filming is considerably lower than London or Paris, and it's a very welcoming city. It also happened to be the city with the fewest COVID numbers at the time when we were trying to make the film, right in the middle of the pandemic. So that gave us the possibility of flying actors in and out and working really without restriction, apart from all the protocols that we followed for COVID. And we never had to shut the production down, which was really miraculous. So yes, Hungary was our secret weapon in terms of being able to put every penny on screen. And the film is full of wonderful messages about the fact that it's never too late to follow your dreams, the fact that you mustn't let go of your dreams, and the fact that kindness ultimately is rewarded, which is, I think, a message that we need to hear more often, that people need to take on board. Yes, it's simple in a way. It's about one woman's pursuit of an impossible dream, but it's also about how this pursuit is a catalyst to the start of the rest of her life. She's someone who has put her heart on ice because she's a widow, and she doesn't think that she has another romantic chapter left in her life. But somehow this dress is a catalyst to reopening that door. And it is ultimately a profoundly romantic story.
I think I'm out of time, but thank you so much for sharing all that with us. And I can't wait for everyone else to see this really wonderful and heartwarming film. Thanks so much.
Thanks for your enthusiasm. It's much appreciated.
Thanks a lot.